I'm Michael Kirby, and I honor the people of Cambodia. I'm here today because back in 1993 to 1996, I served as the special representative of the Secretary General of the United Nations for Human Rights in Cambodia. That position arose out of a clause in the Paris Peace Agreement of 1991. And it is the 30th anniversary of that agreement that we are meeting to celebrate, to reflect upon, and to consider what needs to be done to completely fulfill the objectives of peace and human rights and the rule of law that lay behind the Paris Peace Agreement. I pay respects to the King of Cambodia. I pay respects to the government and people of Cambodia. I pay respects also to people, including in Australia, who worked for the United Nations or who took part in the creation of the Office of the Special Representative for Human Rights. I think especially of my friend and colleague of many years ago, the Honourable Gareth Evans, QC, who was the Foreign Minister of Australia at the time and who played a key role in establishing the basis of the Paris Peace Agreement. And the Paris Peace Agreement had the essential idea that you could not create peace in a country as war-torn and as suffering as Cambodia was in 1990, 1991, without the foundations of universal human rights and the foundation of the rule of law. And so I was appointed to be the guardian of those great principles of the Charter of the United Nations. I didn't have an army. I didn't have blue helmets who could enforce my will. I had to seek the concurrence of those who had power in Cambodia, and that meant working very closely with the government of Cambodia and also with some wonderful people in the United Nations who worked in the Office of the United Nations in Cambodia. And my job was to report to the United Nations and the international community on the steps that were being taken to fulfill the objectives of the Paris Peace Agreement, and to do so with fairness, without belligerence, with courtesy, but with insistence upon respect for the universal principles of human rights laid down in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the other great charters of human rights of the United Nations. The way I did my job was to go to Cambodia twice or three times a year during my service of 3 years, and to speak with government, with civil society, and with foreign missions and others living in Cambodia or working in Cambodia in order to test the water and to see what should be reported to the General Assembly and also to the then Human Rights Commission, meeting in Geneva and in New York. And so my task was that of a reporter, of a friend, of someone who wasn't there just to attack every this and that where the government had not fulfilled the obligations of the United Nations or the recommendations which I, as Special Representative of the Secretary General, had made. That wasn't my task. My task was to report on the good and the bad news, to report on the successes, but also on the failures, and the failures on the part of the government were a significant part of the report, but also the successes, mainly successes of the Cambodian people as they struggled after the Khmer Rouge period and sought to build a strong economy and a strong society that would respect the principles of human rights. There were undoubted achievements. I think one of the biggest achievements was the growth of the economy of Cambodia. Even in the years of 1993 to 1996, when I was special representative, there was a great flowering of the economy of Cambodia. And to some extent, that has continued. It was necessary for me also to report on civil and political rights, because that's the other side of the coin. And the civil and political rights in Cambodia were often the areas where problems arose. But the biggest issues that I had to call to attention were those that concerned the great uh, offices, the institutions of Cambodia that had been laid down in the constitution. The failure to secure a national assembly which was truly representative of the people of Cambodia, the failure to respond when members of the assembly were removed from office, effectively from office by the government of the day, the failure of the judiciary to enjoy the independence of government so that it will criticize government where that's necessary and call attention to the disjunction between some aspects of the law made by the government and by the National Assembly and the universal principles of human rights. The interference in the freedom of the press and the capacity of press outlets to report adversely to the government, uh, and the interference in the freedom of the electoral process. If you don't have a free and fair electoral process, then you're not going to have an effective and democratic National Assembly. Became worse during the time when Hun Sen became the head of government and the prime minister of Cambodia. And the point was reached where he would not speak to me. And I enjoined the Secretary General to send his top representative to come to Cambodia to persuade him to restore conversations and dialogue so that we would get to the bottom of the issues and bring them to the notice of the United Nations, and where necessary, raise money to help Cambodia to reach the goals that were set by the great charters of the United Nations and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. All of these things were done. And for a short time, Hun Sen did agree to meet me again and to converse with me. But that didn't last long, and soon he was not speaking to me again. No speaks is the way children deal with each other. It's not the way that democratically elected governments deal with the high officers of the United Nations. And I made these points over and over again, but to no avail. And in the end, I reported to the United Nations, to the Secretary General and my colleagues in the United Nations, that I was not being able to get through to the government of Hun Sen, and they should start to consider a new appointee as the special representative. They did this, and they appointed a number of special representatives who succeeded me. One by one, they performed their duty, and one by one, they suffered much the same fate. And so, as we celebrate the 30th anniversary of the Paris Peace Accords, which contained the clause that led to the creation of the special representative of the Secretary General for Human Rights in Cambodia. And as we reflect on some good news from Cambodia, but also some news that needs to be improved, and as we reflect upon the principles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that every human being has fundamental human rights. This is not something that belongs to government. It's not something that government gives to human beings. It's something that is inherent in being a human being. As we think of the achievements and the failings, our duty is to renew the commitment of the Paris Peace Agreement, the commitment to the people of Cambodia, the commitment to universal human rights for Cambodia. You can't have long-term economic success and long-term institutions without strong and independent courts, without strong and independent legislatures, National Assembly, and without free and democratic media that bring the truth to the people. And I extend my best wishes and felicitations on the 30th anniversary of the Paris Peace Agreement. Long live the people of Cambodia.